Welcome back to Monitors Unboxed. I've been using the Dell Alienware AW3423DW for about 3 years now, so it's time for my annual report on how this monitor has been going. At this point, you could say I'm a long-term user of this QD-OLED. It's still my primary daily driver gaming display, but is that going to change in 2025? I have some thoughts on that. Before getting into all the details, a quick refresher on how I've been using the AW3423DW in case you missed my 1-year update. In my studio here, I have two main PC setups, a workstation, which is currently using the MSI MPG321URX QD-OLED, as seen in my burn-in update videos, and a gaming rig, which uses the AW3423DW. Each system is dedicated to its task, so the components of the PC and the monitor can be tailored to that setup. While I have been using this Alienware monitor primarily for gaming, that's not the only thing I've been doing on it. I'd say it's been about a 70-30 split between gaming and web browsing, so 70% of the time gaming, 30% of the time browsing the web, watching YouTube videos, managing my Steam library, and so on. I'm not the biggest gamer going around, but across the last 3 years, I've averaged about 500 hours of gaming per year or thereabouts on this display. With some extra time factored in for non-gaming tasks, I've probably used this display for between 2,000 and 2,500 hours now. That is absolutely still on the low side considering how other people may use a display like this, especially if it's a work monitor. For example, 4 hours of use per day over 365 days comes to about 1,500 hours of use. Not heaps more than my estimated usage of this display, but this is based on my experience, and I'm sure there will also be people with similar usage patterns to me. I haven't changed anything about my setup since the last update really. I'm continuing to use an optimal setup for PC OLEDs, which includes using Windows Dark Mode and setting the display to sleep after 5 minutes of inactivity. I have the monitor set to 200 nits in the SDR mode, but often the screen is in the HDR mode for gaming. Originally, I had set the taskbar to minimize, but that was super annoying, so I stopped doing that well over a year ago. In the last two updates, I spoke a bit about burn-in, as I was seeing some signs of burn-in on the AW3423DW. There is a very faint vertical line down the center of the screen that corresponds to the edges of apps when used in a side-by-side configuration. This line was most noticeable when viewing mid-grays in the RGB 50 range or so. After 3 years, this burn-in has not progressed to any significant degree, so there isn't much of a difference to previous years. The faint vertical line is still visible, but not any more visible than last year, and it continues to have virtually no impact on my actual usage of the panel. There's also no noticeable burn-in of any other potentially problematic elements, like the taskbar for example. You could basically class this minor amount of burn-in as no burn-in at all, as it has no real impact on day-to-day usage. When browsing the web, playing games, watching videos, or using the monitor normally, there were no noticeable burn-in artifacts that impacted the experience whatsoever. That's great news after 3 years and matches up with my expectations for QD-OLED burn-in. With the majority of hours spent viewing dynamic content like games, the risk of problematic burn-in is low. It's interesting to contrast these results to what I'm seeing in our long-term productivity burn-in test on the MSI 321URX. 2,000 to 2,500 hours of estimated usage aligns with the 9-month update in our burn-in series. I'm using the 321URX much more often in a much heavier way. In that test, after a similar number of hours, burn-in is much more noticeable, with a more obvious line down the center of the screen, again from side-by-side app usage, and the taskbar is also beginning to burn in. The Alienware's burn-in is far less severe in comparison, as there's been a lot less static content displayed and much more dynamic content like games. This should be really encouraging news for people using an OLED panel primarily for gaming, which is what we recommend in our reviews. After 3 years, burn-in is a non-issue on my AW3423DW, and based on these results, even if you used one of these monitors twice as much as I do, I think it's unlikely you'll see any noticeable burn-in. The only thing you should concern yourself with is the total number of hours viewing static content. The less of that you do, the longer your screen will last. While burn-in hasn't been a concern so far, the AW3423DW is starting to show its age in other ways, especially as I'm continuing to use newer and better OLED panels for reviews. This Alienware is still a great monitor, but I'm starting to get tempted by some of the newer displays that have hit the market this year. One of the more limiting factors I'm finding these days is the refresh rate. Now 175Hz isn't low by any means, but I'm starting to use up the headroom this refresh rate offers. Back when I got the AW3423DW, I was playing games on a GeForce RTX 3090 at reasonable frame rates, but I was rarely pushing up into the, say, 150 plus FPS range. These days though, my PC has gotten faster. I'm now on an RTX 4090, yes I know, YouTuber using a 4090, plus there's been advancements in game technologies. DLSS 4 is much better than previous versions, so more intense upscaling is now viable at a 3440 by 1440 resolution, which increases the frame rate. And we now have access to frame generation as well, which works best on a high refresh rate display with a base render rate above 80 FPS. All of these things make it much easier to max out the display's refresh rate, and often with frame generation, I'm in a situation where the base render rate of the game is in the 80 to 100 FPS range, but frame generation actually pushes the frame rate above 175 FPS. On a 175Hz display, this means either putting up with tearing or limiting the frame rate to 175 FPS, which with frame generation means a capped render rate of 87 FPS and thus worse latency than my hardware is truly capable of. So often I'm choosing not to use frame generation at all, when ideally if there was more headroom, I would be using it. A 240Hz version of this display would offer much better headroom for today's best gaming hardware, even for the sorts of single-player games that I like to play. So 240Hz with a 1440p class resolution is really the minimum standard a high-end buyer should consider in 2025. Luckily, Dell have released an updated version of the AW3423DW that bumps the refresh rate up to 240Hz. It's the AW3425DW, and I'll be reviewing it soon here on the channel. Of course, there are other 240Hz 3440 by 1440 QD-OLED monitors on the market as well. While the AW3423DW launched as a high-end flagship display, I wouldn't consider the 3440 by 1440 resolution as high-end anymore, now that newer OLED panels bring 4K class resolutions to the table. We've gotten 3840 by 2160 in both 32 and 27-inch sizes, and 5120 by 2160 has just debuted in LG's new 45-inch ultrawide, with more sizes to come throughout 2025. So a resolution upgrade would be nice as well to provide a sharper presentation in games and better text clarity outside of games. What hasn't changed all that much since the AW3423DW's debut is the general panel characteristics and HDR performance. Today's QD-OLED panels, for the most part, are not substantially brighter than this original Alienware in either the SDR or HDR modes. 250 nits full screen white is still pretty standard, as is 1000 nits of peak HDR brightness. Dimming in brighter HDR scenes also remains an unsolved issue in the latest QD-OLED monitors when using the brightest peak 1000 HDR setting, something I really would have liked to see resolved by now. WOLED hasn't exactly offered a substantial upgrade in this area either, as for a while there, LG Display were playing catch-up on the brightness front. These days, WOLEDs are a bit brighter than their QD-OLED counterparts, but the differences aren't huge and there are other trade-offs involved like lower color volume and most WOLEDs having a matte finish instead of glossy. It seems that the main OLED manufacturers have largely been focusing on building out their lineup of panel formats, both in terms of size and resolution, so each year we get new sizes, better pixel densities, and higher refresh rates. The underlying OLED technology, though, hasn't been receiving as many improvements, at least to the point where it would offer a truly generational uplift over the initial panels. What I've been really tempted by this year is the LG 45GX950A with its 45-inch 5120 by 2160 WOLED panel, and I think towards the end of 2025, I will ultimately end up switching my gaming rig over to a monitor like this, though probably the adjustable curve version. The 45GX950A does have some downsides that are holding me back for the time being, particularly its 800R curve that I don't like, hence waiting for that adjustable curve version, but the huge panel is an upgrade over the 34-inch Alienware in my opinion, and the higher resolution is fantastic. The refresh rate is another factor that I'm somewhat torn on. 165Hz for that LG isn't that high by today's standards and could run into the same headroom issues as the AW3423DW with its 175Hz refresh rate. So ideally, these 45-inch 5K 2K ultrawides would be 240Hz instead. But because the resolution is higher than existing 3440 by 1440 ultrawides, it will be harder to run games at a high frame rate, so maybe a 240Hz refresh rate isn't as crucial. I guess it's a testament to the longevity of the Alienware AW3423DW that I'm sitting here 3 years later and there's no option on the market right now that is a clear, significant, meaningful upgrade. There's definitely some great new options and I'm getting close to upgrade territory, but nothing so far has been quite right or quite significant enough of an upgrade. This time next year though, this series talking about my daily driver gaming monitor could be a little different, so I'll keep you all informed if I do decide to switch to something new, and I suspect I will be doing so by the end of 2025. So anyway, that's it for this one. Just a nice short update on what I'm currently using as my gaming monitor and how everything on that front is going. If you do want to support Monitors Unboxed and the independent testing that we do right here on the channel, please consider supporting us via our Patreon page. Links to that is in the description below. If you do sign up, you'll get access to some cool benefits. We've got our Discord community, a great place to chat about monitors. We've got ICC profiles for all the monitors we review, and you will be directly supporting the reviews, which form the bulk of the content that's on this channel. So thanks for watching, and I'll catch you in the next one.